Hi, I'm Sarah. And yes, I own my parents' mortgage. Not co-signed, not helped with payments. I own it completely. But when I came home for Christmas, they made me sleep in the freezing garage while my golden child brother got my childhood bedroom and the guest room sat empty with fresh linens. The Christmas dinner table had place cards for everyone except me. But when they found out I held the power to their dream home in my hands, everything shattered. And before we dive into this, what's your biggest family betrayal story? Drop it in the comments because I read every single one. But first, ask yourself this. What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally treated you like you were nothing, while you secretly held their entire future in your palm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through the Illinois suburbs like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, carrying the scent of snow and broken promises. I pulled my rental car into the familiar driveway of 428 Maple Street, the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike on this very concrete, where I'd waited for the school bus every morning for 12 years. The house looked different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. Maybe it was the new outdoor Christmas decorations, elaborate and expensive, the kind that required professional installation. Or maybe it was just me, seeing everything through the lens of the woman I'd become, rather than the hopeful daughter I used to be. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the front door. The wreath hanging there was new, too. Massive, covered in gold ribbons and crystal ornaments that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. It must have cost more than most people spent on their entire Christmas budget. I wondered, with a bitter sort of curiosity, if they'd put it on the credit card they were always complaining about, the one that kept them awake at night, worrying about minimum payments. The irony wasn't lost on me, not when I knew exactly what I knew. I grabbed my overnight bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the front door, my breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the cold air. The porch had been redone since my last visit 6 months ago. New stone pavers, new outdoor furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a suburban home in the Midwest. Everything screamed of money being spent, of keeping up appearances, of the desperate need to look successful even when the foundation was crumbling beneath the surface. I rang the doorbell, a melodic chime that was also new, and waited. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see movement, shadows shifting in the warm light of the interior. The door opened, and there stood my mother, Patricia, dressed in what was clearly a new outfit. A cashmere sweater in deep burgundy, perfectly pressed slacks, jewelry that caught the light just so. She looked polished, put together, like she was expecting company rather than greeting her daughter. "Sarah," she said, and there was something in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. Not warmth exactly, but not coldness either. Something carefully neutral, like she'd practiced the greeting in the mirror. "You made good time." "Traffic wasn't too bad," I replied, stepping into the entryway. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, that artificial Christmas scent that came from candles and air fresheners rather than anything real. "The place looks amazing, Mom. Really amazing." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your father's been working so hard on the renovations. You know how he is with his projects." She gestured vaguely toward the living room, where I could see new furniture, new curtains, new everything. "We wanted everything to be perfect for the holidays." Perfect. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. I wondered what perfect meant to them now, whether it included having their daughter home for Christmas or if I was simply an obligation to be managed, a box to be checked off their holiday list. I followed her deeper into the house, noting the hardwood floors that had been refinished, the fresh paint on the walls, the artwork that was definitely not the same pieces that had hung here during my childhood. "Where's Dad?" I asked, setting my bag down by the staircase. "He's in his office finishing up some work calls," she replied. But her voice had that careful quality again, like she was being selective about what information to share. "You know how busy December gets for him." I did know. Dad had worked in insurance for as long as I could remember, and the end of the year was always his crunch time. But something about the way she said it made me think there was more to the story. Something she wasn't telling me. There was a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of stress being carefully concealed beneath the perfect holiday facade. "And Marcus?" I asked, referring to my younger brother, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose every achievement was celebrated while mine were met with polite acknowledgement at best. "Oh, he's upstairs in his room getting ready for tonight," she said, and for the first time, her smile seemed genuine. "He's so excited you're here. We all are." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I'd learned to read between the lines of my family's conversations years ago, to translate their careful politeness into the truth they never quite spoke aloud. They tolerated my presence, endured it because it was expected, because cutting off your own child completely was still considered unacceptable in their social circles. "Where should I put my things?" I asked, glancing toward the staircase that led to the second floor, to the bedrooms where I'd spent my childhood, where I'd dreamed of the life I wanted to build for myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother's pause was so brief that anyone else might have missed it, but I caught it. The slight hesitation, the way her eyes shifted away from mine before she answered. "Well, sweetheart, we've had to make some adjustments to the sleeping arrangements." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a familiar sensation that I'd learned to associate with disappointment that shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but somehow always did. "Adjustments?" "Marcus has been using your old room as his office space," she explained, her voice taking on that tone people use when they're trying to make something unreasonable sound perfectly logical. "You know how he's been working from home since he graduated, building his consulting business. He really needed the space for all his equipment and files." I nodded slowly, processing this information. My childhood bedroom, the one with the window that faced the old oak tree, the one where I'd spent countless hours reading and dreaming and planning my escape from this suffocating perfection, had been converted into an office for my brother. The brother who was 25 years old and still living at home, still being supported by parents who complained constantly about money, but somehow always found it when it came to his needs. "And the guest room?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. "Oh, we're having some work done in there," she said quickly, too quickly. "The carpet needed to be replaced, and you know how these things go. Once you start one project, you find 10 other things that need attention. The whole room is basically torn apart right now." I glanced through the doorway that led toward the guest room, and from what I could see, it looked perfectly intact. No torn-up carpet, no construction materials, no signs of any renovation work in progress. But I didn't call her out on the lie. I'd learned long ago that confronting my mother directly only led to more elaborate explanations, more complex justifications, for why things couldn't be the way I hoped they would be. "So where exactly am I sleeping?" I asked, and I managed to keep my voice level, neutral, giving no indication of the growing dread that was building in my chest. She brightened, as if she were about to offer me something wonderful rather than something that would cut me to the bone. "We've set up a really cozy space for you in the garage. Your father cleared out a whole section, and we've got an air mattress and some blankets. It's quite comfortable, actually. And you'll have privacy, which I know you value." The garage. They wanted me to sleep in the garage. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stood there in the entryway of the house where I'd grown up, surrounded, Buy expensive renovations and holiday decorations that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and process the fact that my parents considered the garage an appropriate place for their daughter to sleep during Christmas. The garage, I repeated, and I heard my own voice as if from a distance, flat and hollow. It's really not as bad as it sounds, my mother rushed to explain, her voice taking on that slightly defensive tone she used when she knew she was in the wrong but refused to admit it. We've got space heaters out there, and it's actually quite warm once you get them running. And like I said, you'll have complete privacy. No one will bother you. No one will bother you. The phrase echoed in my mind, and I realized that was probably the point. I wouldn't just be sleeping in the garage. I'd be hidden in the garage, tucked away where their friends and neighbors wouldn't see me, where I wouldn't be a visible reminder of their failure to present the perfect family image they'd worked so hard to construct. That sounds, I began, then stopped myself. What was I going to say? That it sounded humiliating? That it sounded like they were treating me like an unwanted guest in the house where I'd grown up? That it sounded like they cared more about maintaining their perfect holiday fantasy than about their daughter's basic comfort and dignity? That sounds fine, I finished instead, because what was the alternative? Start a fight on my first day here? Demand better treatment from people who had already made it clear what they thought I deserved? Pack up and leave, proving once again that I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who couldn't just go along with things and make the best of the situation? My mother's relief was palpable. Wonderful. Let me show you where everything is set up. She led me through the kitchen, past the dining room where I could see the table already set for Christmas dinner with the good china and crystal glasses that only came out for special occasions. I counted the place settings automatically, a habit left over from childhood when I was always responsible for helping set the table. 6 places, 6 chairs, 6 sets of silverware arranged with mathematical precision around a centerpiece of white roses and gold ribbon. 6 places for a family of 4. I didn't ask who the extra guests would be. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't included in that count, that my presence at Christmas dinner wasn't assumed the way it once was. I was a visitor now, someone whose attendance was contingent on good behavior and not causing any disruptions to the carefully orchestrated holiday celebration my parents had planned. The garage door opened with a mechanical groan, and the smell hit me immediately. Motor oil, dust, exhaust fumes, and the lingering scent of lawn chemicals from the fertilizer spreader my father stored in the corner. It was freezing, cold enough, that I could see my breath, despite the 2 small space heaters that were plugged into extension cords and aimed toward a corner where an air mattress had been set up with a pile of blankets. See? My mother said brightly, as if she were showing me a luxury hotel suite rather than a corner of the garage between my father's workbench and the garbage cans. It's quite cozy, and you've got your own entrance so you can come and go, as you please without disturbing anyone. I looked around the space that would be my bedroom for the next 3 days. The concrete floor was stained with oil and covered with the grit that accumulated in garages over years of use. The walls were unfinished drywall, never painted, marked with the scuffs and scratches that came from storing lawn equipment and holiday decorations. The air mattress looked small and lonely in the vast space, like a life raft floating in an ocean of automotive supplies and forgotten household items. The bathroom? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Oh, you can just use the one off the kitchen, she said, waving her hand dismissively. It's just a few steps through the house. Really very convenient. So I'd be sleeping in the garage but traipsing through their perfect house every time I needed to use the bathroom. A walking reminder of the daughter they'd rather keep hidden but couldn't quite bring themselves to completely exclude. I would be the ghost at their Christmas feast, present but not really there, acknowledged but not welcomed. This is perfect, Mom, I said, and I managed to inject just enough enthusiasm into my voice to satisfy her need to believe that this arrangement was perfectly reasonable. Thank you for going to all this trouble." She beamed, genuinely pleased that I was being so understanding, so accommodating, so willing to accept whatever scraps of hospitality they were willing to offer. "I knew you'd understand, sweetheart. You've always been so flexible, so easy to please." Easy to please. I almost laughed at that characterization. If I was easy to please, it was only because I'd learned that expressing displeasure got me nowhere, that voicing my needs or preferences was seen as being difficult, demanding, ungrateful for whatever I was given. After my mother left me alone, in the garage, I sat on the edge of the air mattress and looked around at my accommodations for the holiday weekend. The space heaters were working overtime, making soft humming sounds as they tried to take the edge off the December chill, but I could still feel the cold seeping up through the concrete floor and down from the uninsulated ceiling. I pulled one of the blankets around my shoulders and tried to process what had just happened. This was where I would spend Christmas. In a garage, surrounded by the detritus of my parents' suburban life, breathing air that smelled like motor oil and lawn, chemicals, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps around the garage door, while my brother slept in my childhood bedroom, in the warmth and comfort of the house, with access to a real bathroom and a real bed, and the kind of basic dignity that should come with being a member of the family. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment, thinking about calling my best friend Jessica, or my cousin Amanda, or anyone who might offer me sympathy and validation for how unfairly I was being treated. But what would I say? That my parents were making me sleep in the garage? It sounded so absurd, so petty, like the kind of thing people would assume I was exaggerating or misrepresenting. And even if they believed me, what could they do? Offer me their couch for Christmas? Confirm what I already knew, that my parents' behavior was unacceptable? Instead, I opened my banking app and scrolled through my accounts, looking at numbers that would surprise most people, especially my parents. The consulting business I'd built over the past 5 years had been more successful than I'd ever imagined it could be. What had started as a side hustle helping small businesses with their digital marketing had grown into a thriving agency with clients across the country. I was doing well, better than well, and I'd been careful with my money, investing wisely, saving aggressively, building the kind of financial security that my parents had always stressed was important but had never quite managed to achieve themselves. Which brought me to the folder on my phone labeled Property Documents. I opened it and scrolled through the digital copies of contracts and legal papers until I found what I was looking for. The mortgage assignment agreement that I'd signed 6 months ago, the one that had transferred ownership of my parents' home loan from the bank to me. They had no idea, of course. The monthly payment still came out of their account automatically, just as it always had. But now that money went to me instead of to First National Bank. It had started as a business opportunity. My financial advisor had told me about a client who was selling some residential mortgages as investment vehicles, and the terms had been attractive. Steady income, secured by real estate, lower risk than stocks or other investments. It wasn't until I was deep into the paperwork that I realized one of the mortgages in the package was for 428 Maple Street, my childhood home. I could have backed out, could have excluded that particular property from my purchase and found other investments. But something had stopped me, some instinct that told me this information might be useful someday. Not for revenge exactly, but for protection, for leverage, for the security that came with holding a card that the other players in the game didn't know you possessed. And now, sitting on an air mattress in my parents' garage on December 23rd, I was beginning to understand why that instinct had been right. I heard voices from inside the house, muffled by the walls but clear enough that I could make out the general tone, if not the specific words. Laughter, animated conversation, the sounds of a family enjoying each other's company. My brother's voice, deep and confident, holding court the way he always did when he had an audience. My father's laugh, hearty and genuine in a way I hadn't heard directed at anything I'd said in years. My mother's voice, warm and encouraging, praising someone for something, offering the kind of unconditional support that I'd spent my entire life hoping to earn. I listened for a few more minutes, then opened my laptop and got to work. I had a project deadline coming up next week, and if I was going to be spending my Christmas vacation in a garage, I might as well be productive. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably earning more money per hour sitting on this air mattress than my father made at his insurance job. But success, I'd learned, was relative. It didn't matter how much money you made or how well your business was doing if your own family still saw you as the problem child who needed to be managed and contained. The cold was getting worse as the sun went down, and the space heaters struggled to keep up with the dropping temperature. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the garage door and finding every small gap to send icy drafts through the space. I wrapped a second blanket around myself and tried to focus on my work, but my fingers were getting stiff from the cold, and the laptop keyboard felt like ice beneath my hands. This was going to be a long 3 days. But as I sat there in the garage, listening to my family's Christmas celebration continue without me, I found myself thinking about those mortgage documents on my phone. About the power that came with holding someone's financial security in your hands. About the look on my parents' faces when they eventually learned that their perfect Christmas, their perfect house, their perfect life was built on a foundation that belonged to the daughter they'd relegated to sleeping with the lawnmower. I wasn't planning revenge exactly, but I was planning something. And for the first time since I'd arrived at 428 Maple Street, I found myself smiling. The wind howled against the garage door like a living thing trying to get in, and I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders as I tried to focus on my laptop screen. It was barely past 8 o'clock, but the temperature had dropped so dramatically that even with both space heaters running at full blast, my breath was still visible in the air. The concrete floor beneath the air mattress felt like it was made of ice, and no amount of blankets seemed to provide enough insulation from the cold that seemed to seep up from the very foundation of the building. I'd been working for about an hour when I heard footsteps in the kitchen, followed by the sound of the door that connected the house to the garage opening just a crack. Light spilled through the gap, along with a wave of warm air that carried the scent of whatever my mother was cooking for dinner. The contrast was so stark that for a moment I felt dizzy, the difference between the frigid garage and the heated house hitting me like a physical blow. "Sarah?" My mother's voice called softly. "Are you doing okay out here?" I looked up from my laptop, my fingers so stiff from the cold that I had to flex them several times before I could respond. "I'm fine, Mom. Just getting some work done." She opened the door a little wider, and I could see her silhouetted against the warm, golden light of the kitchen. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of the dining room table, now fully set for what looked like a much more elaborate meal than I'd expected. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and I could see multiple courses worth of dishes being prepared. "We're having a few people over for dinner," she said, and there was something apologetic in her tone, though not apologetic enough to actually change anything. The Hendersons from next door, and the Clarks from Dad's office. Just a small Christmas Eve gathering. Christmas Eve. She'd made up a name for it, as if having a dinner party on December 23rd was a long-standing tradition rather than something she'd apparently planned without mentioning it to me. I wondered when she'd decided to host this gathering, whether it had been planned for weeks or whether it was a spontaneous decision made after I'd already arrived and been safely tucked away in the garage where I wouldn't interfere with their social obligations. "That sounds lovely," I said, and I managed to keep my voice steady and pleasant, the way she'd trained me to respond to information about family plans that didn't include me. "I hope you have a wonderful time." She hesitated in the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might actually invite me to join them. The pause stretched long enough that I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, the pathetic optimism of a daughter who still, despite all evidence to the contrary, believed that her parents might remember that she was their child, too. "There's leftover casserole in the refrigerator if you get hungry," she said finally. And plenty of sandwich fixings. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home, in the garage. While they entertained neighbors and colleagues in the actual home, the warm, beautifully decorated space where real family members were welcome. "Thank you," I said. "That's very thoughtful." She closed the door and the garage plunged back into its cold, isolated darkness. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the thin line of light that showed under the door, listening to the sounds of preparation and anticipation that filtered through the walls. My mother's voice, animated and cheerful, giving instructions to someone. My father's laugh, the deep, satisfied sound he made when he was in his element, playing host and showing off their beautiful home to people whose opinions mattered to them. The dinner party began an hour later, and from my position in the garage, I had a front row seat to the audio track of my family's social performance. I could hear everything through the thin walls, the greetings and exclamations of delight as guests arrived, the compliments on the house and the decorations, the cheerful chatter as people settled in for what was clearly intended to be an elegant evening. I heard my father's voice, confident and expansive, telling the story of their recent renovations. "Patricia has such an eye for design," he was saying. "She completely transformed the guest bathroom. You should see the tile work she picked out." There was pride in his voice, genuine admiration for my mother's taste and vision, the kind of respect and appreciation that I'd spent my entire life hoping to earn from him. Then my brother's voice joined the conversation, and I could hear him being introduced to the guests as if he were some kind of local celebrity. "This is our son Marcus," my mother said, and the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. "He's building his own consulting business, working from home, completely self-directed. We're so proud of how entrepreneurial he is." Entrepreneurial, the word hit me like a slap. My brother, who was 25 years old and still living at home, still having his meals cooked and his laundry done by our mother, was described as entrepreneurial. Meanwhile, I'd built a successful business from the ground up, had been financially independent since I was 22, owned property, had employees and clients and a reputation in my industry, and I was sleeping in the garage because there apparently wasn't room for me at their table. I listened to them describe Marcus's business plan, his innovative approach to client relations, his bright future in the consulting world. They spoke about him the way parents should speak about their children, with unconditional pride and absolute confidence in his abilities. I wondered what they said about me when people asked, whether they mentioned my business at all or simply changed the subject to more pleasant topics. "And your daughter?" I heard Mrs. Henderson ask. "Is she joining you for the holidays?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind of silence that spoke volumes about how my parents viewed my presence in their lives. "Sarah's here," my mother said finally, and her tone was carefully neutral. "She's working on some project. You know how dedicated she is to her career." Dedicated to her career. As if my work were some kind of obsession or character flaw rather than the thing that had made me successful and independent. As if choosing to work during a family gathering were a personal failing, rather than a reasonable response to being excluded from that gathering in the first place. The conversation moved on to other topics, and I tried to focus on my own work, but the cold was making it increasingly difficult to concentrate. My hands were so stiff that typing was becoming painful, and even with the blankets wrapped around me, I couldn't stop shivering. The space heaters were doing their best, but they were no match for the December wind that found every crack and crevice in the garage's construction. I closed my laptop and burrowed deeper into the pile of blankets, trying to generate enough body heat to stop the violent shivering that was making my teeth chatter. This was ridiculous. I was a grown woman with a successful business and enough money in the bank to buy a house twice the size of this one, and I was huddled in a garage like some kind of refugee, listening to my parents entertain guests in the home where I'd grown up. That's when I heard my name mentioned again, and this time I pressed closer to the wall to make sure I could hear every word. Sarah's always been a bit of a loner, my father was saying, and there was a dismissive quality to his voice that made my stomach clench. Very independent, very focused on her own thing. She's never been much for family gatherings or social events. A loner, independent, focused on her own thing. The way he said it made it sound like these were character defects rather than survival strategies I'd developed in response to years of being made to feel unwelcome at family gatherings and social events. She's doing well for herself, though, my mother added, and I could hear the careful diplomacy in her voice. She has her own business, works with computers and marketing and that sort of thing. Very modern. That sort of thing. As if digital marketing were some kind of mysterious voodoo, rather than a legitimate business that required skill, knowledge, and years of hard work to master. As if my success were somehow accidental or temporary, something that didn't quite count as real achievement in their eyes. How wonderful, Mrs. Clark said politely. It's so nice when young people find their passion. Find their passion, as if I were still searching for my place in the world, rather than having already built a life and career that most people would envy. I wondered what they'd say if they knew that I probably made more money in a month than my father made in 6, that I owned property, that I had employees and clients who respected my expertise and sought out my advice. But most of all, I wondered what they'd say if they knew about the documents on my phone, the mortgage papers that made me, quite literally, their landlord. The dinner party continued for another 2 hours, and I listened to every minute of it. I heard them praise my parents' hospitality, compliment the food and the wine and the beautiful decorations. I heard them discuss their children's accomplishments, their holiday plans, their recent vacations and home improvements. I heard them laugh at my father's jokes and ask for my mother's recipes, and generally treat my parents like the successful, accomplished people they clearly saw themselves as. And through it all, I remained invisible. The daughter who was there but not there, acknowledged but not included, tolerated but not welcomed. By the time the guests finally left, sometime after 11 o'clock, I was so cold that I'd lost feeling in my toes and fingers. The space heaters had been running for hours, but they were fighting a losing battle against the December wind and the complete lack of insulation in the garage. I'd tried every possible combination of blankets and positions, but nothing seemed to generate enough warmth to make the air mattress comfortable. I heard my parents cleaning up from the party, their voices cheerful and satisfied as they discussed how well the evening had gone. They sounded energized, happy, the way people sound when they've successfully pulled off an event they're proud of. I heard my mother laughing at something my father said, heard the domestic sounds of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher and leftovers being stored in the refrigerator. It occurred to me that I could go inside and ask for another blanket, or suggest that maybe the guest room wasn't quite as torn up as they'd claimed, or simply point out that the garage was uninhabitably cold and that there had to be a better solution. But I'd learned long ago that advocating for myself in this family was seen as being difficult, demanding, ungrateful for whatever accommodation they'd made. So instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder labeled Property Documents. Again. I scrolled through the mortgage papers, the assignment agreements, the legal documents that made me the holder of my parents' home loan. I read through the terms and conditions, the clauses about default and foreclosure, the fine print that gave me, as the mortgage holder, certain rights and powers that my parents didn't even know I possessed. I wasn't planning to use these documents. Exactly. I wasn't planning to foreclose on my childhood home or demand immediate payment or do anything that would actually harm my parents financially. But there was something comforting about knowing that I had options, that I wasn't completely powerless in this dynamic that had defined our relationship for so many years. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard earlier, about my father describing me as a loner who wasn't much for family gatherings. I thought about my mother's dismissive description of my work as that sort of thing. I thought about the way they'd hidden me away in the garage while they entertained guests, as if my presence would somehow taint their perfect holiday celebration. And I thought about the moment, which would come eventually, when they would learn the truth about who really held the power in our relationship. Not because I would tell them necessarily, but because these things had a way of coming to light. Because secrets, especially financial secrets, rarely stayed hidden forever. I imagined the look on their faces when they realized that the daughter they'd relegated to the garage was the same daughter who could, with a single phone call, change their entire living situation. I imagined how they'd react when they understood that all their renovations, all their entertaining, all their careful construction of the perfect suburban lifestyle was built on a foundation that belonged to me. The thought warmed me more than the space heaters ever could. By morning, the temperature in the garage had dropped so low that there was actually frost on the inside of the windows. I woke up shivering violently, my entire body stiff and aching from a night spent trying to stay warm on an air mattress that provided no insulation from the frozen concrete floor. My breath came out in clouds so thick they looked like smoke, and when I tried to sit up, I discovered that the bottle of water I'd left next to the air mattress had a thin layer of ice on top. I wrapped myself in every blanket I could find and stumbled toward the door that led into the house, desperate for warmth and a functioning bathroom. The kitchen was blissfully warm when I stepped inside, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the heated air wash over me like a benediction. The contrast was so extreme that I felt dizzy, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. My mother was at the kitchen island, still in her bathrobe, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked up when I entered, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw me. "Good heavens, Sarah, you look absolutely frozen," she said, and there was genuine concern in her voice. "Are you all right?" I wanted to laugh at the question. Was I all right? I just spent the night in a garage in December in Illinois, sleeping on an air mattress with inadequate heating, while my parents entertained guests in the warm, comfortable house where I'd grown up. Was I all right? "I'm fine," I said instead, because that's what she wanted to hear, what she needed to hear in order to continue believing that the sleeping arrangements she'd provided were reasonable and adequate. Just need to warm up a bit. She nodded, already turning her attention back to her phone. "There's fresh coffee in the pot," she said absently, "and I think there are some muffins left from yesterday's brunch." Yesterday's brunch. Another meal I hadn't been invited to? Another family gathering that had happened without me. I wondered how many other social events they'd planned for the weekend that I wouldn't be included in, how many other ways they'd found to make it clear that while I was technically welcome in their home, I wasn't really part of their lives. I poured myself a cup of coffee and wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth that seeped through the ceramic and into my frozen fingers. The kitchen was beautifully decorated for Christmas, with garland draped around the windows, and a small tree on the counter surrounded by wrapped presents. Everything looked perfect, picture-ready, like something out of a holiday magazine. "Sleep well?" my mother asked, though she didn't look up from her phone. "Like a baby," I lied, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like heaven after the long, cold night in the garage. She smiled, satisfied with my response, and we fell into the kind of comfortable silence that came from years of perfecting the art of polite conversation that revealed nothing important about how we actually felt about each other. That's when my father walked into the kitchen, dressed for golf despite the December weather. He was whistling under his breath, clearly in an excellent mood, probably still basking in the glow of last night's successful dinner party. "Morning, kiddo," he said to me, ruffling my hair like I was still 10 years old. "Hope we didn't keep you up too late with all our chattering." Kiddo, at 28 years old, with a business that employed 6 people and generated more revenue than most small companies, I was still kiddo to him. Still the child who could be patted on the head and dismissed, whose comfort and dignity were secondary to whatever social obligations they'd prioritized. "Not at all," I said, matching his cheerful tone. It sounded like a lovely evening. "Oh, it was," he said, pouring himself coffee and adding cream with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully hosted an impressive social gathering. The Hendersons were just raving about your mother's decorating, and Jim Clark was asking about my investment strategy. Seems like everyone's looking for financial advice these days. Financial advice? I almost choked on my coffee. My father, who worked in insurance and had never, to my knowledge, made any particularly savvy financial moves, was dispensing investment wisdom to his colleagues. I wondered what he'd say if he knew that his daughter had built a diversified investment portfolio that included real estate, stocks, bonds, and various other assets that he probably didn't even know existed. But most of all, I wondered what he'd say if he knew that one of those real estate investments was the very house he was standing in, sipping coffee and congratulating himself on his financial acumen. The irony was so rich, so perfectly absurd, that for a moment I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Here was my father, the man who'd relegated me to sleeping in the garage, dispensing financial advice to his friends while being completely unaware that his own mortgage was held by the daughter he clearly didn't consider worthy of basic respect and consideration. "Dad," I said carefully, "can I ask you something about your investment strategy?" He beamed, clearly delighted to have his expertise acknowledged by his wayward daughter. "Of course, sweetheart. Always happy to share what I've learned over the years." "How do you feel about real estate as an investment vehicle?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response. "Specifically residential mortgages?" His expression grew more serious, more professorial, as he considered the question. "Well, real estate can be solid," he said thoughtfully. "Steady returns, tangible assets, generally appreciates over time. Though you have to be careful about market fluctuations and interest rates." "And mortgages specifically?" I pressed. "As an investment product?" He nodded sagely. "Mortgage-backed securities can be excellent for diversified portfolios. Steady income stream, backed by real property. Of course, you need significant capital to get into that market. Not something most people can access." Significant capital. Not something most people can access. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were taking mental notes rather than calculating exactly how much his own mortgage was worth and how much income it generated for me each month. "That's fascinating," I said. "I had no idea you knew so much about mortgage investments." He practically glowed with pride at the compliment. "Well, you pick things up over the years in this business. The key is understanding risk versus reward and knowing your market." Know your market. I couldn't have agreed more, and I was beginning to understand my market very, very well. Christmas Eve morning arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it a snowstorm that transformed the suburban landscape into something that belonged on a holiday card, but made the garage feel like an Arctic survival scenario. I woke up to the sound of wind howling through every possible gap in the structure. And when I checked my phone, the temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, with a wind chill that made it feel like -20. The space, heaters had been running all night, but they were fighting a losing battle against physics and poor insulation. I could actually see ice crystals forming on the metal walls of the garage, and my breath created clouds so thick they obscured my vision. Every muscle in my body ached from shivering, and when I tried to get up from the air mattress, I discovered that my joints were so stiff from the cold that movement was genuinely painful. But what struck me most wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the absolute silence from the house. No one had checked on me during the storm. No one had knocked on the door to see if I needed additional blankets or heaters. No one had suggested that maybe, given the extreme weather conditions, sleeping in an unheated garage wasn't such a great idea after all. I wrapped myself in every available blanket and made my way to the door that connected to the house, desperate for warmth and basic human consideration. When I stepped into the kitchen, the contrast was so dramatic that I actually gasped. The house was not just warm, but cozy, heated to the kind of comfortable temperature that made you want to curl up with a book and stay inside all day. The smell, of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven filled the air, and I could hear Christmas music playing softly from the living room. My family was gathered around the kitchen island, all of them looking perfectly rested and comfortable in their pajamas and robes. My mother was pulling a tray of pastries from the oven, while my father read the newspaper and my brother scrolled through his phone. They looked like a scene from a Christmas morning commercial, the picture of domestic bliss and holiday contentment. "Sarah!" my mother exclaimed when she saw me, though her tone suggested surprise rather than concern. "I didn't expect you to be up so early. How was your night?" I stared at her for a moment, trying to process the question. How was my night? I had spent 8 hours in sub-zero temperatures in an unheated garage, listening to the wind tear at the building while ice formed on the walls around me. I had probably gotten a total of 2 hours of actual sleep, and I was fairly certain I was showing early signs of hypothermia. "It was fine," I heard myself say, because what was the alternative? Break down crying in their perfect Christmas morning scene? Demand better treatment from people who had already made it clear what they thought I deserved? Admit that I was struggling, that I needed help, that their solution to my accommodation wasn't working? "Wonderful," she said brightly, turning back to her baking. "I'm making cinnamon rolls for Christmas Eve breakfast. It's become such a lovely tradition." A tradition that, apparently, didn't include setting a place for me at the table. I counted the plates she'd set out. 4. 4 placemats, 4 sets of silverware, 4 coffee cups arranged around the kitchen island. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. I wasn't expected to join them for their traditional Christmas Eve breakfast. My brother looked up from his phone for the first time since I'd entered the room. "Rough night?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. Not concern exactly, but a kind of knowing amusement that suggested he was fully aware of exactly how uncomfortable my accommodations were. "Nothing I couldn't handle," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm pretty resilient." He smiled, and there was something cold in it. "Yeah, you always were good at just dealing with things, making the best of whatever situation you found yourself in." Making the best of whatever situation I found myself in, as if my current situation were some kind of natural disaster rather than a deliberate choice my family had made about how to treat me. As if sleeping in a garage during a blizzard were just another life challenge to be overcome, rather than a basic failure of hospitality and human decency. "It's a useful skill," I said calmly, pouring myself coffee with hands that were still shaking slightly from the cold. "You never know when you might need to adapt to unexpected circumstances." Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because he looked at me more sharply, as if he were trying to figure out whether there was a hidden meaning in my words. But before he could respond, my father folded his newspaper and announced that he had some errands to run before their Christmas Eve dinner. "Christmas Eve dinner?" I asked, and I managed to keep my voice casual despite the growing certainty that I already knew the answer to my question. "Oh yes," my mother said, not looking up from her baking. "We're having the Hendersons and the Clarks over again, plus a few other families from the neighborhood. It's going to be such a lovely evening." Another dinner party, another social gathering in my childhood home to which I was not invited. Another evening of listening to my parents entertain guests while I sat alone in the garage, excluded from the warmth and fellowship that should have been mine by birthright. "That sounds wonderful," I said, and I meant it in a way that they couldn't possibly understand, because this pattern, this systematic exclusion and dismissal, was building to something. Each slight, each moment of being overlooked or relegated to the margins, was adding to a growing sense of clarity about who these people really were and what they really thought of me. And more importantly, it was reinforcing my understanding of the power dynamic that existed between us, the one they didn't even know about. I spent the morning in the local coffee shop, working on my laptop and slowly thawing out from my night in the Arctic garage. The warmth was heaven, and the Wi-Fi was better than what my parents had at the house, so I was actually able to get quite a bit done. But mostly, I used the time to think, to process what was happening and to plan my next moves. Because I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about Christmas accommodations or family dynamics. This was about respect, about recognition, about the fundamental question of how people treated those they claimed to love when they thought there would be no consequences for their actions. My parents had decided that I was someone who could be managed, contained, and dismissed. They had calculated that I would accept whatever treatment they offered because I was too polite, too well-trained, too desperate for their approval to demand better. They had counted on my continued compliance with their narrative about who I was and what I deserved. They had miscalculated badly. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd been working on for the past 6 months. The ones related to my real estate investment portfolio. The mortgage assignment for 428 Maple Street was just one of several properties I'd acquired, but it was by far the most personally significant. I'd structured the purchase carefully, working through a series of intermediary companies and legal entities that would make it very difficult for anyone to trace the ownership back to me without conducting a thorough investigation. But the paperwork was all legitimate, all legally binding, all properly filed with the appropriate government agencies. I owned my parents' mortgage, and with it came certain rights and responsibilities that they had no idea I possessed. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Rebecca Martinez, the attorney who had helped me structure the real estate investments. She specialized in property law and had walked me through all the legal implications of mortgage ownership when I'd first started building my portfolio. I sent her a text message. Quick question about mortgage holder rights. Can you call me when you have a few minutes? She called back within an hour, and her voice was warm and professional when she answered. Sarah, how are the holidays treating you? About as well as expected, I said wryly. Listen, I have a hypothetical question about one of the properties in my portfolio. Shoot. If a mortgage holder wanted to clarify the terms of the loan agreement with the borrowers, what would be the proper legal procedure? There was a pause, and I could hear Rebecca shifting papers on her desk. Clarify how, exactly? Are we talking about a modification or just ensuring that the borrowers understand their obligations? More the latter, I said carefully. Ensuring that they understand who they're actually making payments to and what rights the mortgage holder has under the terms of the agreement. Ah, she said, and I could hear the understanding in her voice. You want to send a formal notification of mortgage ownership transfer? Exactly. That's completely standard, she said. In fact, it's required under federal law. Borrowers have a right to know who holds their mortgage and how to contact them with questions or concerns. You should have sent that notification within 30 days of the transfer, actually. I felt a little flutter of something that might have been guilt. And if I forgot to send it initially? Rebecca laughed. Then you send it now. Better late than never. I can draft something for you if you'd like. Standard boilerplate language, very professional, nothing threatening or alarming. Just a formal notification that the mortgage has been transferred and providing contact information for future correspondence. That would be perfect, I said. How quickly could you have something ready? I could have it to you by this afternoon, she said. Email, okay? Email's great. And Rebecca, could you include information about the borrower's rights under the agreement? Payment schedules, default provisions, that sort of thing? Of course. Standard disclosure language. Anything specific you want emphasized? I thought about my parents' perfect Christmas celebrations, their expensive renovations, their confident assumptions about their financial security and social status. Just the importance of maintaining current payments and understanding the consequences of default. Got it. I'll have this to you in a couple of hours. After I hung up, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, sipping my third latte and watching the snow fall outside the window. I thought about the conversation I'd just had, about the legal document that would soon be in my possession, about the moment when my parents would receive official notification that their daughter now held their mortgage. I wasn't planning to use this information maliciously. I wasn't going to demand immediate payment or threaten foreclosure or do anything that would actually harm them financially. But I was going to make sure they understood exactly who held the power in our relationship and exactly what that power meant. Because sometimes the only way to get respect is to demonstrate that you have the ability to withdraw the things that people take for granted. The notification letter arrived in my email at 3 o'clock that afternoon, just as Rebecca had promised. It was perfect, professional, formal, completely legal, and absolutely devastating in its implications. The language was standard boilerplate, the kind of letter that mortgage companies sent out every day, but the content was explosive. It informed the borrowers that their mortgage had been transferred to a new holder, provided contact information for future correspondence, outlined their rights and obligations under the agreement, and included a detailed breakdown of payment schedules, interest rates, and default provisions. It was the kind of letter that would make any homeowner's heart skip a beat, especially when they realized that their financial security was now in the hands of someone they'd never met. Except, of course, they had met me. They'd raised me, claimed to love me, and currently had me sleeping in their garage during a blizzard. I read through the letter 3 times, checking every detail, making sure that everything was accurate and properly formatted. Then I saved it to my phone and closed my laptop, satisfied that I now had exactly what I needed for the conversation that was coming, the conversation that would change everything. I drove back to my parents' house as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if I hadn't been dreading the return to my Arctic accommodations. The driveway was already full of cars when I arrived, and I could see warm light glowing from every window of the house. Their Christmas Eve dinner party was clearly in full swing. I parked at the end of the driveway and sat in my rental car for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation that filtered through the walls. Through the front windows, I could see my parents and their guests, all of them, dressed in their holiday best, raising glasses of wine and clearly having a wonderful time. The scene looked like something out of a movie, the perfect suburban Christmas celebration, and I was about to walk past all of that warmth and fellowship and lock myself into a garage that was probably even colder now than it had been the night before. But as I sat there watching my family's party, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, and not sadness either. Something cleaner and more focused. A sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years of trying to earn their approval and acceptance. I pulled out my phone and opened the letter from Rebecca. I read it one more time, absorbing every word, every implication, every legal detail that would soon reshape my parents' understanding of their financial situation and their relationship with me. Then I forwarded the letter to my personal email account, the one that was linked to my printer at home. Because sometime very soon, my parents were going to receive an official notification that would change everything they thought they knew about power and security and family dynamics. But not tonight. Tonight, I was going to let them enjoy their party, their perfect Christmas Eve celebration with their carefully curated guest list and their beautiful decorations and their absolute certainty that they had everything under control. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and Christmas Day, I thought, would be the perfect time for them to receive their gift from me. I gathered my things from the car and walked through the side gate to the garage, past the warm, glowing windows where my family was celebrating without me. The temperature in the garage had dropped even further, and I could see my breath in thick clouds as soon as I stepped inside. The space heaters were running, but they were fighting a losing battle against the bitter cold that seemed to seep through every surface. I set up my laptop on the small table my father had provided and connected to the Wi-Fi network. Then I opened my email and began composing a message to Rebecca, asking her to prepare one additional document, a formal request for mortgage payment history and account status. the kind of routine inquiry that mortgage holders were entitled to make about their investments. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it properly, professionally, with all the legal documentation and procedural correctness that would make it impossible for anyone to claim that I was acting inappropriately or vindictively. I was simply exercising my rights as a mortgage holder to ensure that I had complete information about my investment. The fact that this investment happened to be my childhood home, and that these borrowers happened to be the people who had given birth to me and were currently treating me like an unwanted house guest, was just one of those ironies that made life interesting. As I worked on my laptop in the freezing garage, listening to the sounds of my family's Christmas celebration through the walls, I found myself thinking about a conversation I'd had with my business mentor years ago. She'd told me that the most important lesson in business was understanding leverage, knowing what cards you held and when to play them. I'd built my entire career on that principle, on understanding market dynamics and power relationships and the delicate balance of give and take that governed every successful transaction. But I'd never applied those lessons to my family relationships. I'd continued to operate from a position of emotional need rather than strategic strength, hoping that if I was good enough, successful enough, accommodating enough, they would eventually see my value and treat me accordingly. I'd been playing the wrong game entirely, but now, sitting in their garage with legal documents on my phone that could change their entire living situation, I finally understood what leverage meant in a family context. And I was beginning to understand that sometimes the only way to get respect was to demonstrate that you didn't actually need the approval you'd been seeking. The party continued late into the evening, and I listened to every minute of it from my position in the garage. I heard toasts and laughter, Christmas carols, and animated conversation. I heard my parents being complimented on their hospitality, their beautiful home, their obvious happiness and success. And I heard my brother regaling the guests with stories about his consulting business, his innovative approach to client relations, his bright future in the entrepreneurial world. Not once did I hear my name mentioned. Not once did anyone ask where I was or suggest that I should join the celebration. I was as invisible to this gathering as if I had never existed at all. But invisibility, I was beginning to understand, could be its own kind of power. Because while they were celebrating and entertaining and performing their roles as the perfect suburban family, I was quietly positioning myself to change the entire foundation of their carefully constructed lives. And the beautiful thing about leverage was that it worked best when the other party had no idea you possessed it. By the time the last guest left and the house finally fell silent, I had everything prepared. The letter was ready to be printed and mailed. The additional documentation was completed and properly formatted. All the legal and procedural requirements had been met. All I had to do now was decide exactly when and how to deliver the news that would transform my parents from the people who controlled my living situation into the people whose living situation I controlled. Christmas morning, I thought, would be perfect timing. After all, what could be more festive than the gift of truth? Christmas morning dawned with the kind of brutal clarity that only comes after a storm. The snow had stopped falling, but the temperature had plummeted even further, creating a landscape that sparkled like crystal but felt like stepping into a freezer. I woke up in the garage with ice actually forming on the inside of my sleeping bag, my body so stiff from the cold that it took several minutes of careful movement before I could even sit up properly. But something was different this morning. Despite the physical discomfort, despite spending another night as an exile in my own childhood home, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, almost excitement. Today was the day everything would change. Today was the day my family would learn exactly who they'd been underestimating for all these years. I pulled on every layer of clothing I'd brought and made my way into the house, where the contrast in temperature was so dramatic that my glasses immediately fogged over. The kitchen was empty but warm, with the lingering scent of cinnamon and coffee suggesting that my family had already begun their Christmas morning routine. I could hear voices from the living room, animated and cheerful, the sound of wrapping, paper being torn, and delighted exclamations over gifts received. I poured myself coffee and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching my family's Christmas morning unfold. They were all in their pajamas, sitting around the beautifully decorated tree, exchanging presents with the kind of genuine joy and affection that I remembered from my own childhood, back when I was included in these moments of family intimacy. My brother was opening what appeared to be an expensive watch, probably a Rolex based on his reaction. My mother was exclaiming over a jewelry box that looked like it had come from an upscale boutique. My father was unwrapping what looked like golf equipment, professional-grade clubs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, expensive gifts, luxury items, the kind of presents that suggested my parents had been very generous with their Christmas budget this year, despite their constant complaints about money being tight and their need to be careful with expenses. I counted the presents under the tree, noting the careful distribution of wrapped packages. Multiple gifts for Marcus, several for each parent, a few items that were clearly meant to be shared family presents. And in the far corner, almost hidden behind the larger packages, 2 small wrapped items with my name on them, 2 presents. After 3 decades of Christmas mornings in this house, my allocation had been reduced to 2 small gifts that looked like afterthoughts rather than expressions of love and thoughtfulness. I watched them for several more minutes, observing the easy intimacy, the way they moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of people who truly enjoyed each other's company. This was the family I'd been excluded from, the warm circle of affection and belonging that apparently had no room for the daughter who'd given them everything and received cold concrete floors in return. "Sarah," my mother called when she finally noticed me standing in the doorway. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Come join us." There was something forced about her enthusiasm, a brightness that felt performed rather than genuine. But I walked into the living room and took the seat they indicated, a chair positioned slightly outside the main circle, close enough to be included but far enough away to maintain the distinction between real family members and tolerated guests. "We saved your presents for when you woke up," my father said, though the way he said it suggested that they'd actually finished their own gift exchange and were now humoring me with the leftovers. He handed me the 2 small packages, and I unwrapped them carefully, trying to inject appropriate levels of gratitude and delight into my reactions. A gift card to a chain restaurant I'd never expressed any interest in, and a generic scented candle that still had the clearance sticker on the bottom. $25 and a discounted candle. That was the monetary value my parents had assigned to their relationship with me this Christmas. "These are lovely," I said, and I managed to sound sincere. "Thank you so much." "We weren't sure what you'd like," my mother said, and there was something defensive in her tone. "You're so independent, so particular about your tastes. We thought practical gifts would be best." Practical gifts. I looked around at the expensive watch, the luxury jewelry, the professional golf equipment, and tried to understand how a restaurant gift card and a clearance candle qualified as practical, while a Rolex was apparently a thoughtful expression of love. But I smiled and thanked them again, because that's what was expected, and because I had bigger plans for this Christmas morning than arguing about the relative value of their gift-giving choices. "I have something for you too," I said, pulling out my phone. "Just let me print it out." My father looked puzzled. "Print something out?" "A little Christmas surprise," I said, connecting my phone to their wireless printer. "Something I've been working on for a while." The printer whirred to life, and I could see my family exchanging glances, probably wondering what kind of gift required printing rather than wrapping. I collected the pages as they emerged, 3 sheets of official-looking documents with letterheads in legal language, and the kind of formatting that immediately signaled serious business. "What is it?" Marcus asked, curiosity overcoming his usual dismissive attitude toward anything involving me. I handed the documents to my father, since he was the one whose name appeared first on the mortgage paperwork. It's a notification letter, I said calmly. About your mortgage. He took the papers with a frown, clearly confused about why his daughter would be giving him mortgage-related documents for Christmas. But as he began to read, I watched his expression change from puzzlement to concern, to something approaching shock. I don't understand, he said slowly, looking up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. This says that our mortgage has been transferred to. He looked back at the paperwork, reading the name listed as the new mortgage holder. Sarah M. Chen Holdings, LLC. That's correct, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. My mother leaned over to read the documents, her face going pale as she processed the information. Sarah, what is this? What does this mean? It means, I said, settling back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who was finally about to reveal the card they'd been holding all along, that 6 months ago, I purchased your mortgage from First National Bank as part of a real estate investment portfolio. You've been making your monthly payments to me since July. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that house. It was the silence of people whose entire understanding of reality had just been fundamentally altered, whose assumptions about power and control and family dynamics had been turned completely upside down. Marcus was the first to find his voice. You're saying you own our house? I'm saying I own your mortgage, I corrected. Which means I hold the deed until the loan is paid in full. It's a common investment strategy for people with sufficient capital. Sufficient capital, my father repeated, and there was something hollow in his voice. How much capital are we talking about? I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen so they could see the account balances. The numbers were large enough that my mother actually gasped. My consulting business has been very successful, I said simply. Much. More successful than I think any of you realized. They stared at the screen, and I watched them process not just the size of my bank accounts, but the implications of what this meant about their assumptions regarding my financial situation, my professional success, my place in the family hierarchy. You've been lying to us, my mother said, and there was anger in her voice now, the kind of righteous indignation that people feel when they discover they've been operating on false information. I haven't lied about anything, I replied calmly. I've never misrepresented my income or my business success. You've simply never asked for specifics, and you've made assumptions based on your own perceptions rather than facts. But you let us think, my father began, then stopped, apparently unable to articulate exactly what he'd thought or why he'd thought it. I let you think what you wanted to think, I said, which apparently was that I was some kind of struggling freelancer rather than the CEO of a company that employs 6 people and generates 7 figures in annual revenue. 7 figures. The words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing them to reconcile their mental image of me as the problem child who needed to be managed with the reality of me as a successful businesswoman who had been quietly building wealth, while they treated her like a charity case. Why didn't you tell us? My mother asked. And for the first time, there was something that might have been hurt in her voice. When? I asked. During which conversation about my life and career? Were you interested enough to ask for details? When you were describing my work as that sort of thing to your dinner guests? When you were explaining to people that I'm not much for family gatherings? When exactly should I have interrupted to provide a financial disclosure? The questions hung between us, unanswered and probably unanswerable. Because we all knew that the conversations I was referring to had never really happened, that their interest in my life had always been perfunctory, polite inquiries that expected brief, unrevealing responses. Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from shock to something that looked like calculation. So, what does this mean? What are you planning to do with this information? Nothing dramatic, I said. The mortgage terms remain exactly the same. The payment schedule is unchanged. Your interest rate is locked in for the duration of the loan. From a practical standpoint, nothing about your financial obligations has changed. But you could change things, my father said, and there was a new wariness in his voice. If you wanted to. I could, I agreed. Mortgage holders have certain rights under the terms of the loan agreement. I could demand full payment immediately. If you defaulted, I could refuse to approve modifications or refinancing. I could foreclose if payments were missed. The word foreclose seemed to hit them like a physical blow, and I watched my parents exchange glances that spoke of genuine fear, perhaps for the first time understanding that their financial security was not as solid as they'd believed. Are you threatening us? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm explaining the terms of a legal contract, I replied. The same contract you signed when you originally purchased this house, just with a different mortgage holder. I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply clarifying the current situation. The current situation, Marcus repeated, and there was something bitter in his voice. Which is that our sister owns our house. Which is that your sister owns your mortgage, I corrected again, and has been quietly collecting your monthly payments for 6 months while sleeping in your garage and being excluded from your family gatherings. The irony of the situation was finally beginning to sink in, and I could see them starting to understand the full scope of what had been happening. While they'd been treating me like an unwelcome guest, I'd been their landlord. While they'd been dismissing my professional success, I'd been their creditor. While they'd been performing their perfect family dynamics for their friends and neighbors, they'd been doing it in a house whose mortgage was held by the daughter they'd relegated to sleeping with the lawnmower. This is insane, Marcus said, standing up abruptly. This is some kind of power trip. You're trying to manipulate us. I'm not trying to manipulate anyone, I said calmly. I'm simply providing information that you have a legal right to know. In fact, I should have provided this notification when the mortgage was first transferred. I'm actually late in fulfilling my legal obligations as a mortgage holder. Legal obligations, my father repeated, as if the phrase were in a foreign language. Yes, I said, pulling out my phone again. I've been consulting with a property attorney to make sure I understand all my rights and responsibilities. Would you like me to provide her contact information in case you have questions about the process? The offer of legal consultation seemed to underscore the seriousness of the situation, and I watched my parents realize that this wasn't some elaborate joke or temporary power play. This was real. This was legally binding. This was their new reality. I need some air, my mother said suddenly, standing up and walking toward the kitchen. I need to think about this. She disappeared through the doorway, and I could hear her opening and closing cabinet doors with unnecessary force, the sound of someone who needed to do something physical to process emotional shock. My father sat back in his chair, still holding the mortgage notification letter, staring at it as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more palatable. I don't understand how this happened, he said finally. I don't understand how we didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked, I said simply. You made assumptions about my financial situation based on incomplete information, and those assumptions shaped how you treated me. But your assumptions were wrong. So what now? Marcus asked, though he remained standing as if sitting down would somehow acknowledge the legitimacy of this new power dynamic. Now, I said, we have a conversation about respect, about family, dynamics, about the difference between how you treat people when you think they need you versus how you treat them when you realize you need them. We don't need you, Marcus said quickly, but there was something defensive in his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand that this statement might not be entirely accurate. Don't you? I asked. Your mortgage payments go to me. Now. Your credit rating depends on maintaining a good relationship with me. Your ability to refinance or modify your loan terms requires my approval. Your financial security is, quite literally, in my hands. The reality of their situation was starting to sink in, and I could see them beginning to understand that the daughter they'd been dismissing and marginalizing now held significant power over their lives. "What do you want?" my father asked, and there was something defeated in his voice. "I want to be treated like a member of this family," I said simply. "I want to be included in family gatherings instead of hidden in the garage. I want my professional success to be acknowledged, rather than dismissed. I want the same level of respect and consideration that you show to your other child." "And if we don't?" Marcus challenged. I shrugged. "Then I'll continue to be a professional and responsible mortgage holder, and you'll continue to make your monthly payments to me. Nothing has to change legally. But the relationship we have going forward will be based on mutual understanding rather than your assumptions about who has power and who doesn't." My mother returned from the kitchen, her face composed, but her eyes red-rimmed. She sat down, heavily in her chair, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I think," she said slowly, "that we need to have a very different conversation about a lot of things." "I think you're right," I agreed. And for the first time, in years, possibly decades, I felt like I was sitting at that table as an equal rather than as a supplicant hoping for approval. Not because I'd used my financial power to threaten or manipulate them, but because I'd finally stopped pretending that their opinion of me mattered more than my opinion of myself. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. It was honest in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable, direct in ways that challenged all of our established patterns, and ultimately more productive than decades of polite avoidance and careful diplomacy. We talked about assumptions and expectations, about success and failure, about love and respect and the difference between the two. We talked about the garage and the dinner parties and the gift cards and the Rolex, about what those choices said, about how they valued our relationships. And slowly, carefully, we began to talk about what it might look like to rebuild those relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than familial obligation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no tearful reconciliations or dramatic apologies. But by the time we finished talking, I was no longer sleeping in the garage. The guest room was suddenly available after all, and my mother was making plans for a proper Christmas dinner that included a place setting for me. More importantly, I was no longer the daughter who hoped desperately for their approval. I was the daughter who had learned that sometimes the only way to get respect is to demonstrate that you don't need the things you thought you wanted. And as I settled into the guest room that night, warm and comfortable for the first time since I'd arrived, I realized that the best Christmas gift I'd ever given myself was the gift of understanding my own worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. The mortgage payments would continue to arrive each month, a quiet reminder of the power dynamics that now governed our relationship. But more than that, they would be a reminder that success isn't just about building wealth or achieving professional recognition. Sometimes success is simply about refusing to accept less than you deserve and having the resources to back up that refusal. And sometimes, the most powerful position you can occupy is the one where you no longer need the approval you once desperately sought. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.